Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about the Midnight Carnival of 1891 and its collection of performers who were, in the eyes of the law, already in their graves. A mystery buried in the dust of time, a truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know where are you listening to this story from. That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. In the waning days of October 1891, when the very air over New Hampshire seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of the coming frost, the maple leaves had surrendered their fiery brilliance for the muted, melancholy color of rusted copper. Over the huddled rooftops of Barford Hollow, the smoke from the textile mills and iron foundries hung low, a perpetual grey shroud that tasted of coal dust and tireless industry. For the people living under that shroud, the season's only expected excitement was the annual harvest fair, a fleeting celebration of cider, prize-winning pumpkins, and a brief respite from the relentless grind of the factory floor. They were, in the quiet hopes for normalcy, profoundly wrong. What was about to be discovered within the skeletal remains of the abandoned Barford Opera Pavilion would not only stain the town's name in the annals of American crime, but would also carve scars so deep into the community's psyche that no passage of time, no blanket of winter snow, could ever truly cover them. It was a scar born from a truth so monstrous, so fundamentally perverse, that it challenged the very notion of life and death itself, forcing an entire town to confront the terrifying possibility that the graves in their churchyards were not as final as they believed. The Barford Opera Pavilion had once been the jewel of the town, a monument of brick and gilded plaster erected in a brief, optimistic boom period 30 years prior. It had hosted traveling Shakespearean troupes, political rallies, and famed sopranos whose voices, it was said, could make the crystal chandeliers tremble. Now, it was a tombstone to that forgotten optimism. The building had been shuttered for years, a victim of economic downturn and changing tastes. Its once magnificent, gilded balconies, where the town's elite had once sat, were collapsing inward, their ornate plasterwork crumbling into a fine, choking dust that coated everything. The grand stage boards, once trod upon by celebrated actors, were now warped and swollen from the relentless New England damp, buckling in ways that resembled a frozen, uneven sea. It had become a local legend, a place of morbid fascination for the town's youth. The children, fueled by whispered stories told in darkened bedrooms, dared each other to throw stones at its broken, soot-stained windows. They spoke of the ghost of a jilted actress who was said to wander the upper floors and of secret tunnels that supposedly ran from the basement to the riverbank tunnels used by smugglers during the war. They claimed the adults of the town, however, afforded it no such romanticism. They avoided it altogether, their gazes sliding past its decaying facade as if it were invisible. Their avoidance was born not of superstition, but of a more practical, weary understanding. It was a place of failure, a reminder of promises unfulfilled. It was an edifice that seemed to breathe its own stale, cold air, a hollowed-out carcass that waited, patient and malevolently silent, for something to stir once more within its rotting heart. On the evening of October 28th, that stirring finally, horrifically, came to light. Two mill workers, Irish immigrants named Cormac Riley and Silas Quinn, were making their way home after a grueling 12-hour shift. Their faces were etched with a fatigue so deep it seemed embedded in their very bones. Their conversation, a low murmur of complaints about wages and longing for a home they hadn't seen in years. It was Silas who noticed it first, a single service door, long thought to be boarded shut, now standing carelessly ajar, a sliver of profound darkness against the weathered wood. A flicker of curiosity, perhaps, or the simple desire for a shortcut that would shave a precious few minutes off their walk, compelled them to push it open. Inside, the air was thick and foul, a physical presence that caught in their throats. The weak, flickering beams of their oil lanterns cut feeble swaths through the oppressive blackness, revealing a world of decay. But as their eyes adjusted, they picked up something else: movement, furtive, flickering shapes in the deep shadows, where there should have been only the stillness of abandoned things. An unspoken agreement passed between them, a mixture of foolish bravado and a genuine, prickling sense of unease. They descended the narrow, treacherous backstairs into the basement, the stone steps slick with the damp, unidentifiable slime. It was there, in the subterranean dark, that their shouts of discovery tore through the night, a sound as sharp and alarming as the factory whistle at shift's end. But these were not the organized cries of industry. They were ragged, primal screams of pure, unadulterated horror. By the time the town's constables, led by a portly and perpetually flustered man named Chief Miller, arrived on the scene, their own lanterns were trembling in their hands, casting chaotic, dancing shadows on the walls. The light revealed the unthinkable. 17 human beings were chained by their wrists and ankles to the crumbling stone walls. They were arranged in a semicircle, as if positioned for some grotesque, silent audience. Some were slumped in heaps on the damp floor, too weak to even lift their heads at the sudden intrusion of light and noise. Others stared forward with a terrifyingly vacant expression, their eyes sunken pits of despair in gaunt, skeletal faces. Their skin, deprived of sun and proper nutrition, was a pallid, almost translucent white, stretched taut over jutting bones. Their bodies were as thin as figures from a medieval painting of the Great Famine. The stench was a physical assault, a nauseating miasma that made the constables gag and pull their coats over their faces. It was a complex and layered odor, the sour, animal smell of unwashed flesh, the sharp, metallic tang of rusted iron, and something else, something more sinister, a sickly sweet and chemical scent that clung to the damp, suffocating air, a scent that spoke of drugs and decay. But it was not merely their horrific physical condition that turned the stomachs of these hardened men and made them question the stability of their own sanity. It was a fact so bizarre, so utterly impossible, that it seemed to belong to the pages of a macabre penny dreadful. For as Chief Miller began the grim task of trying to identify the captives, a young constable, sent running to the town hall to check the official records, returned white-faced and trembling. Every single one of the 17 individuals found chained in that basement, according to the official records of Burford Hollow and 3 surrounding counties, had been declared dead. Some had supposedly perished months earlier, others years. Their names, the constable stammered, were written in the precise, looping script of the official ledgers. Their causes of death listed as drowning, consumption, or a factory accident. Their graves, in some cases, were marked with weathered stones in local cemeteries. Their passing had been publicly mourned by families who believed they had lost their loved ones to the cruel, indifferent hand of fate. And yet here they were, breathing in shallow, ragged gasps in the lantern glow, their chests rising and falling almost imperceptibly in the cold, damp tomb that had become their world. The living dead of Burford Hollow had been found, And with that discovery, the quiet, predictable world of the town was shattered forever. That night, as the captives were carried out one by one on makeshift stretchers, their faces shielded from the gawking, horrified crowds, a different kind of hush fell over the town. It was not the quiet of sleep, but the stunned, fearful silence of a community forced to confront a terrifying reality. The evil they had always feared, the stuff of whispered ghost stories told to frighten children, was not some phantom lurking in the deep woods or some ancient curse upon the land. It had been living, breathing, and operating from the very center of their town, hidden in plain sight behind a veneer of civic pride and a carefully cultivated, almost sacred, indifference. To understand how such a vast and prolonged horror could fester undetected, one must first understand the very soul of Burford Hollow. In 1891, it was a place caught precariously between two identities. On the map, it was a modest industrial town, tucked unassumingly between the granite-faced foothills of the White Mountains and the tangled, dark forests that bled into Vermont's border. It was a place of geographic isolation, a small pinprick of civilization in a vast wilderness, but on the ground, experienced through the senses. It was a hive of relentless, punishing activity. It was a symphony of smoke-belching chimneys, the high-pitched screech of rail spurs, and rows of identical clapboard houses that leaned toward the river. The very river that had once powered its mills and now seemed to carry away its secrets. Its population, just over 8,000 souls, was a patchwork of Irish, Italian, and Eastern European immigrants, all drawn to this remote corner of New England by the same universal promise, steady work in the mines and foundries, and the desperate, often unrealized hope that hard labor could carve out a life better than the one they had been forced to leave behind. But with that promise of work came an unspoken rule, a brutal social contract common to mill towns across the nation, places populated by strangers fleeing from poverty, famine, and the law. The rule was simple. You minded your own business. It was a survival mechanism etched into the town's collective consciousness. No one asked too closely about the origins of a new arrival, about the scars on his hands or the haunted look in his eyes. And certainly, no one pressed for answers when someone suddenly vanished. People disappeared. It was a sad, immutable fact of life in a place like Burford Hollow. A worker, exhausted and careless, might fall into a mine shaft, his body never recovered. A family, crushed by debt to the company store, might pack up their meager belongings and leave in the dead of night, seeking better wages in a neighboring state. A desperate, lonely soul might succumb to the river's cold, final embrace. These disappearances were noted with a collective shrug, a brief flurry of gossip in the local tavern, and then, purposefully, forgotten. It was in this cultivated silence, this collective agreement to look away from the unpleasant and the inconvenient, that a man like Alistair Vennick did not just survive. He thrived. He was a man who seemed crafted from a different, more refined clay than the gritty folk of Burford Hollow. Tall, impeccably dressed in tailored suits of a cut and quality never before seen in the town, with a voice as smooth and resonant as varnished oak. Alistair Vennick appeared in the spring of 1887 as if from another world. He stepped off the midday train from Boston, a single fine leather suitcase in hand, and immediately began to weave his spell. He spoke of powerful connections in New York, of a prestigious Dutch family name that traced its lineage back to the founding of New Amsterdam, and of his grand ambition to make investments in the noble arts. Most residents, weary from their labors and unconcerned with the affairs of the wealthy, didn't care to check if these claims were true. The gold coins he spent freely at the tailor, the taverns, and the livery stable were proof enough that he was a man of substance, a man worth humoring. With surprisingly little fanfare, Venick purchased the derelict Burford Opera Pavilion that summer, paying in cash and dismissing the building's advanced state of decay with a wave of his hand. To anyone who asked, he explained that it would serve as the winter quarters for his magnificent traveling show. The Midnight Carnival, the idea, against all odds, appealed to the town's dormant sense of civic pride. The thought of an established, nationally recognized venue attracting performers from across the country was a balm to their collective sense of isolation and insignificance. It would surely put Burford Hollow on the map for something other than its iron output. But there was another, more crucial and carefully concealed layer to Venick's charm, his uncanny knack for making friends in useful places, for identifying the subtle fractures in a man's integrity and exploiting them. One of his first and most important friends was Sheriff Roland Cray, a man in his 50s whose formidable physical presence belied a spirit long since eroded by cynicism. Cray's badge had, over the years, become more of an ornament than a symbol of his oath. He had the square, powerful build of a man who had hauled coal in his youth, and the tired, assessing eyes of someone who had learned early on that trouble was best avoided, especially if it came with a cash-filled envelope. For a monthly retainer of $50, a small fortune, more than most miners made in 2 months of back-breaking labor, Cray became the invisible, impenetrable wall that kept inconvenient questions and worried relatives from ever reaching Venick's door. Another of these useful friends was Dr. Wilhelm Drexler, who arrived a quiet 6 months after Venick, setting up a small, discreet medical practice in the rooms above the town apothecary. Drexler presented himself as a learned German physician, a specialist in the rare and fascinating disorders of human development. His thick, round spectacles, his clipped, authoritative accent, and his air of European erudition gave him an aura of authority that few in the working-class town, with their limited education and inherent respect for formal learning, dared to challenge. But his diploma, framed proudly on his wall, was a masterful forgery from a print shop in Philadelphia. His well-worn medical bag, as later court documents would reveal, carried more narcotics, powerful sedatives, and chemical restraints than it did actual remedies. And his true, unspoken work was not to heal, but to keep certain people compliant, docile, and forgetful for as long as his employer, Mr. Venick, required their services. To the casual observer, the partnership between the charismatic showman, the corrupt lawman, and the fraudulent doctor seemed entirely harmless, even congenial. They were often seen together at the town's private club, 3 respectable gentlemen enjoying each other's company over a game of cards and expensive cigars. But behind these closed doors, in the quiet, smoke-filled rooms where the town's business was unofficially conducted, they had constructed a monstrous, ruthlessly efficient machine, a machine that fed on the overlooked, the unwanted, and the forgotten. A machine whose gears turned in silent, perfect synchrony, lubricated by a steady flow of greed, corruption, and the profound, soul-crushing indifference of the town around them. The Midnight Carnival's lurid posters promised marvels and wonders, and in every town it visited, those wonders came at a cost that no one in the paying audience could ever possibly guess. If the Beaufort Opera Pavilion was the cage, then the hunting ground stretched far beyond the borders of New Hampshire, into the desperate and hopeful heart of America itself. Alistair Venick had a singular predatory talent for spotting what he euphemistically called rare investments. To his eye, a man born with a twisted spine was not a person enduring a life of pain, but a potential act to be billed as the human pretzel, A girl missing an arm could be dressed in angelic white, made to sing for a supper, and marketed as a fallen seraph. And an immigrant with no family nearby, no roots to hold him down, was a perfect candidate for disappearing without a single soul raising an alarm. The process, refined over years of practice, was both simple and diabolically cruel. Dr. Wilhelm Drexler would typically arrive in a target town a week ahead of the carnival, advertising free medical consultations for the poor and the infirm. Historical accounts describe his manner as unnervingly patient, his voice reassuring. He listened to their ailments, nodded with practiced sympathy, and offered prescriptions, powders, drops, or injections that were said to bring immediate relief. What they brought, instead, was oblivion. A measured blend of morphine and chloral hydrate, a concoction Drexler had perfected, would render his patients unconscious within minutes. When they awoke, they would be far from home, deep in the damp chill beneath the opera pavilion, with no coherent sense of how they had arrived. The first days in the basement were, by design, the hardest. Those who fought back were beaten into submission by hired thugs. Those who begged for their freedom were met with a wall of indifferent silence. Sheriff Roland Cray, meanwhile, ensured that any missing persons reports filed in the region were quietly shelved, and local coroners, their palms greased with Venix coin, would sign falsified death certificates without question. Sometimes a grieving family was told their loved one had drowned or perished in a sudden factory accident. Other times, for a particularly persistent family, they were even shown a body, a nameless vagrant's, crudely made to resemble the missing person through gruesome means. From there, the systematic reconstruction of a human soul began. It was not enough to simply force a captive onto the stage. Venix's artistry demanded something more profound. He wanted them remade so completely that they forgot who they had been. Drexler's chemical regimens, administered daily, dulled memory and eroded willpower, creating a pliable, suggestible state of mind. Their days were filled with repetitive, agonizing drills contortion practice until joints swelled and popped, strength feats until muscles tore, endless voice training under the constant threat of punishment. They were given new, theatrical names, stitched into elaborate costumes that concealed their scars, and told again and again that their families had abandoned them, that the world outside believed them to be dead. The final, most devastating act of psychological warfare came in the form of forged letters. These documents, penned in what looked like the handwriting of a mother or a brother, would express not sorrow, but relief at their passing. It was the final, severing blow to any remaining ties with a life beyond the carnival. It was a system designed to break people in body and spirit, and for nearly 5 years, it worked without a serious hitch. The Midnight Carnival became known for the uncanny, haunting quality of its performers. The way they seemed wholly absorbed in their acts. No one in the audience knew it was because they had been systematically stripped of everything else. But that was before a young woman named Eleanor Price found a crack in the cage. And once she slipped through, the chain of events that would destroy Venix's empire began, inexorably, to turn. For nearly 3 years, Eleanor Price had lived in the half-light beneath the Barford Opera Pavilion, her world reduced to the scrape of chains and the measured, echoing footsteps of her captors. She no longer knew which day of the week it was, or which month. Only the routines told time: morning feedings of thin gruel, evening injections that brought a welcome fog, and the endless aching drills in the central rehearsal room. Her act was called the Porcelain Dove. Dressed in a snow-white gown, she would stand perfectly still and sing ethereal melodies without moving her arms, her sleeves artfully pinned to her sides to suggest a delicate absence rather than a brutal restraint. The audiences never saw the deep bruises beneath the silk, or the way her breath hitched from the permanent damage to her ribs. Eleanor, like the others, had learned not to hope. That was Dr. Drexler's real triumph, not the drugs, not the beatings, but teaching you that the outside world was gone forever, that you were already a ghost in the eyes of anyone who had once loved you. The other captives whispered sometimes in the dark, but their words were jumbled, dreamlike. The drugs clouded their minds and fractured their memories into 1,000 meaningless shards. And then came the mistake. It was made by Peter Lang, Drexler's skittish young assistant, who had been tasked with administering Eleanor's evening sedative, whether through fatigue, nerves, or a sudden, fleeting flicker of conscience that he himself did not understand. He measured the dose wrong. Instead of the heavy, suffocating fog that usually wrapped her mind, Eleanor felt a thin, rare clarity spreading through her. Her thoughts, for the first time in years, began to sharpen. The customary heaviness in her limbs lifted just enough for her to notice that her ankle shackle, fastened by Lang in his haste, had not been properly secured. She waited. She had learned, in that terrible place, that patience could be a sharper weapon than any blade. When the long corridor grew quiet and the oil lamps were dimmed to a dull glow, she began to work at the chain, inch by inch, with movements so small they were nearly imperceptible. She manipulated the locking pin until, with a faint, metallic click, it slipped free. The shock of the cold stone floor under her bare feet was the first thing she had truly felt in months. The basement was a labyrinth of stone and shadow, but Eleanor had studied it in the darkness, mapping it in her mind during countless sleepless nights. She moved by memory, past Jonas Breck's cell, where the massive man stirred at the sound of her soft step. She passed the singing cage of Celeste Marrow, who lifted her head and watched with wide, silent eyes, saying nothing. At the far wall, a ventilation shaft opened into the underbelly of the stage. Beyond that was a storage room with a high, narrow window. She had passed it 100 times without a shred of hope. Now, it was her only chance. The window was stiff with age and damp, but the wood around the frame had rotted at the corners. She forced it open, the splintering wood tearing at her raw fingers, and squeezed her emaciated body through the narrow opening into the cool night. The air hit her like water after a lifetime of thirst, and for a long moment she simply stood there, gasping, breathing in the scent of pine and wet earth. Then she ran, through the dark alley, past the shuttered bakery, down into the gas-lit main street of Beaufort Hollow. By sheer chance, her disparate, stumbling path led her to the office of Jonathan Hale, the editor and sole reporter of the Beaufort Gazette. He was working late, as he often did, his desk piled high with proofs and ink-stained pages. When the frantic pounding came at his door, he opened it to find a girl who looked no older than 22, barefoot and bleeding, her simple dress torn to ribbons. But it was her eyes that seized him. They were wide, hollow, and yet burned with a fierce, desperate light. She locked her gaze on his and clutched his sleeve with a hand like a claw. "They're still down there," she whispered, her voice a dry, rasping sound. 17 of us. They told me I was dead. They showed me the papers. But I'm not yet. Hale, a man accustomed to the small dramas of a small town, was momentarily speechless. He ushered her inside, sat her by the warmth of the cast-iron stove, and poured water into a chipped mug with a trembling hand. as she drank. She spoke in broken, fragmented bursts, telling a story of chains and needles, of rehearsals that went on until her voice cracked and her body gave out. She named others Jonas, Celeste, a boy called Marco. She described the basement's narrow halls, the specific types of locks on the cells, the false walls hiding secret passages, and finally, the ledger, a thick, leather-bound book that Venick kept hidden in his office. A book that listed them all not as people, but as investments, with cold, methodical notes on where they had been taken and what they had cost. Jonathan Hale listened, his journalistic skepticism eroding with each precise, chilling detail. The way she described the pavilion's hidden architecture was too accurate for invention. The names she whispered were vaguely familiar, ghosts from half-forgotten tragedies over the past few years. And in her voice, beneath the tremor of trauma and fear, was a resonant chord of truth he could not ignore. By the time she finished her story, the old newsroom clock was striking midnight, and Hale knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that if even a fraction of her story was real, he was looking at the most dangerous and important story of his life. Jonathan Hale had spent enough years in small-town newsrooms to know that the truth was rarely hiding in plain sight. It was buried in ledgers and the kind of paper trails that most people no longer cared to follow. A victim's testimony was the heart of a story, but irrefutable proof was its sword. The morning after Eleanor Price appeared like a ghost in his office, he left the Barford Gazette in the hands of the young printer's apprentice and took the early train to the county seat. His pretense was ordinary, almost mundane, a research project on local mortality rates for a planned editorial about workplace safety in the mines. The clerks in the registrar's office, flattered by the idea of their work being mentioned in print, gave him unrestricted access to stacks of death certificates dating back a decade. Surrounded by the smell of dust and old, brittle ink, Hale combed through them one by one. Patterns, faint at first, began to surface with alarming clarity. Men with unusual height or specific physical deformities, women with distinctive, memorable features, young immigrants with no listed next of kin, all marked as dead from sudden, non-communicable illnesses or freak accidents. Many of these deaths, he noted with a quickening pulse, coincided neatly with the arrival of the Midnight Carnival in neighboring towns and counties. Cross-referencing the names Eleanor had whispered to him in the dead of night, Jonas Breck, Celeste Morrow, the boy called Marco, he found each one meticulously recorded as deceased, according to testimony from the period. Some of these certificates had been signed by coroners known to be regular card-playing companions of Sheriff Roland Cray. That night, back in Burford Hollow, Hale didn't go home. He went straight to the sheriff's office in the basement of the town hall. The place smelled of stale pipe smoke and damp leather, its walls plastered with wanted posters that were curling at the edges. Sheriff Cray was there, seated behind a battered oak desk, cleaning his revolver with a deliberate, unnerving slowness. He didn't look up when Hale entered. "I hear you've been asking some unusual questions up at the county seat," Cray said finally, his voice low and flat, devoid of any warmth. "I've been looking into death certificates," Hale replied, keeping his own tone steady, professional. Some of the dates seemed to line up with the carnival's visits. Quite a coincidence. Cray's eyes lifted then, and they were as cold and assessing as a winter sky. Without another word, without any warning, he swung the heavy revolver's butt across Hale's cheekbone. The crack of impact rang out in the small room, and Hale crumpled to the floor, the coppery taste of his own blood filling his mouth. The sheriff stood over him, the revolver now aimed squarely at his head. "You're going to forget whatever that girl told you," Cray said softly, the quietness of his voice more terrifying than a shout. You never saw her. You never heard her. And if I hear you're spreading stories about respectable men like Mr. Vennick, well, accidents happen in mining towns. Men disappear in the shafts all the time. The words were meant to frighten, to bury the story under a mountain of fear. But to Hale, bleeding on the cold stone floor, they were the final, absolute confirmation. Cray had all but admitted his role in protecting Vennick's monstrous operation. He knew then that this story would not just be dangerous, it would be lethal if he made one wrong move. But he also knew he had only one path forward. He had to get inside that pavilion, the night after his confrontation with Sheriff Cray. Jonathan Hale locked the Gazette's front door early and drew the blinds. Eleanor sat at his desk, a thick wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her hair still tangled from her escape. On the ink blotter between them lay a rough sketch she had made of the pavilion's basement. The lines were shaky, drawn by a hand that still remembered the feel of iron shackles. But the details were terrifyingly clear: doorways, alcoves, the location of the chained cells, and most important, a small square she had marked ledger. That's Vennick's office, she said, tapping the mark with a finger that was still raw. The book is hidden behind the right-hand wall panel. I've seen him open it. He keeps everything there. Names, places, the price he paid for each of us. Hale leaned back in his chair, weighing the immense risk. If we can photograph that ledger, he said, his voice barely a whisper, and document the conditions in the basement, it won't matter what Cray or anyone else says. We'll have proof. The plan took shape in the hushed, candlelit confines of the newsroom. They would strike on a night when Vennick and his inner circle were known to be away at the Barford Gentlemen's Club, a private house on the edge of town where cards and brandy flowed until dawn. Eleanor would guide Hale through the basement's treacherous layout. He would carry a compact camera, a supply of flash powder, and a case of extra glass plates. Their goal was not rescue that would take more men and more firepower than they possessed. It was to get undeniable evidence into the hands of someone beyond Sheriff Cray's corrupt reach. But they weren't the only ones making plans. Across town, in the dimly lit surgery above the apothecary, Dr. Wilhelm Drexler was inventorying his medical cabinet when he noticed something amiss. A vial of chloroform, half a bottle of his potent morphine solution, and, most curiously, several jars of photographic chemicals were gone from his stores. At first, he suspected a simple theft by a desperate addict, but the specific combination of items formed a picture that turned his stomach cold. Someone was preparing to enter the basement not to free the captives, but to document them. The escape of Eleanor Price had already been a bruise on his professional pride. Now, it was beginning to look like the first crack in their entire carefully constructed facade. By the time he crossed the cobblestones to Vennick's townhouse, Drexler's usual clinical detachment had given way to a palpable urgency. In the lamplight of the parlor, he laid out his findings to Vennick and Sheriff Cray. Vennick listened in complete silence, the glow from the hearth throwing sharp, dramatic planes across his handsome face. When Drexler finished, the showman stood and poured himself a measure of cognac. "It seems," he said, his voice dangerously calm, "that we may have to enact Protocol Ashen ahead of schedule." The phrase was one the three men rarely spoke aloud. It was their final contingency. It meant the complete liquidation of every asset, destroying all records, silencing every witness, and erasing all evidence that the Midnight Carnival had ever been more than harmless entertainment. It meant setting a fire that would consume the old opera house and everyone chained within it. What none of them knew was that their accelerated timetable would collide head-on with Hale and Eleanor's desperate gamble, and that both sides would be in the basement before the week was out. The chloroform took hold fast. Hale fought to keep his eyes open, to cling to consciousness. But the world tilted and folded in on itself. His last clear image was of Eleanor collapsing beside the open ledger panel, her hand reaching for him even as her gaze went blank. When he woke, it was to the familiar sound of dripping water and the brutal bite of cold iron on his own wrists. The chains fixed him to the same damp stone walls he had just photographed what felt like hours before. Eleanor was in the cell to his left, still unconscious, her breathing shallow but steady. Dr. Drexler was the first to visit. "Mr. Hale," he said with chilling clinical detachment, his spectacles glinting in the lamplight. "You've been very curious. In my experience, curiosity is a dangerous ailment." Sheriff Cray's methods were more blunt, a leather strap across the ribs, a bucket of freezing water, and slow. Deliberate threats whispered about what would happen to Eleanor if he didn't forget everything he had seen. But it was Alistair Vennick who truly unsettled Hale to his core. The showman entered without haste, pulling up a chair to study Hale as if appraising a new painting. "You have a presence," Vennick said finally, a strange, dreamy quality in his tone. "Intelligent eyes, good bone structure, with the right adjustments. You could be quite compelling on stage." Hale remained silent, his jaw tight with fury. "I'm thinking," Vennick went on, ignoring him. "A tragic figure, the scholar of sorrows. Perhaps a man of letters driven mad by forbidden knowledge. You'd wear a long, tattered coat and speak in riddles. Audiences adore the melancholy type." In that moment, Hale understood the true depth of Vennick's corruption. It wasn't just greed or cruelty. It was a form of possession, a desire to own people so completely that even their suffering, their very sanity, became a performance for his own twisted artistry. Vennick believed his basement was the end of every story. But Jonathan Hale had planted seeds of his own, long before he ever set foot beneath the pavilion. Weeks earlier, as the shadow of the Midnight Carnival grew over Burford Hollow, Hale had been corresponding with Margaret Lill, a formidable investigative reporter at the Boston Chronicle, and one of the few women in New England's press corps who could match his own stubbornness. As his suspicions deepened, the tone of his letters had shifted. He described the unexplained disappearances, the carnival's unsettling habit of arriving just before someone vanished, and in his final letter, sent 2 days before Eleanor had stumbled into his office, he named Alistair Vennick outright. He ended with a chilling instruction: if she didn't hear from him in 10 days, she should contact federal authorities. In Boston, Margaret did not take such warnings lightly. When Hale's 10th day of silence came and went, she wasted no time. She visited her contacts in the newly formed Bureau of Investigation, sent telegrams to friendly editors in New York and Philadelphia, and quietly circulated Hale's earlier letters to ensure a paper trail would remain. Her most daring move was a telegram addressed to Sheriff Roland Cray himself. On its face, it was polite and professional. Conducting research on traveling entertainments. Require interview with Jonathan Hale and Alistair Vennick. Federal documentation team arriving November 1st. Please arrange meetings. M. Lell, Boston Chronicle. The message reached both Gray and Vennick by nightfall. Vennick read it over a snifter of brandy, the glass trembling slightly in his hand. A federal team meant his network of bribed local officials would be useless. Panic did not suit him, but it quickened his mind. The schedule for Protocol Ashen would have to accelerate. Every captive in the basement, including his two newest acquisitions, would be silenced before Margaret Lell ever set foot in Burford Hollow. This acceleration, however, forced the hand of the weakest link in their chain. That night, as Peter Lang helped Dr. Drexler prepare for the grim task ahead, he watched the doctor work with unhurried precision, drawing morphine and then strychnine into glass syringes. "They'll be quiet," Drexler murmured, almost to himself, one by one, like snuffing out candles. Faced with the reality of helping to murder 17 people in cold blood, the self-deception Peter had lived with for years finally fell away. Sent upstairs to fetch more supplies, he didn't stop. He slipped out the pavilion's side door and ran across the empty town square, his breath steaming in the cold. His destination was the parsonage of Reverend Elias Munro. The minister, roused from sleep, listened without interruption as Peter's story tumbled out the injections, the chloroform, the final, murderous night that was now only hours away. "If what you say is true," Munro said, his face grim in the dim parlor light, "we have hours, not days." Urgent telegrams were immediately sent to the state police barracks in Concord and to the governor's office. Peter, his fear now replaced by a fragile resolve, agreed to return to the pavilion and delay Drexler's timetable by any means necessary. By the time the first official telegrams were clattering out of Burford Hollow's telegraph office, Peter was already walking back toward the pavilion, rehearsing the lies he would tell to keep 17 heartbeats going until help arrived. Jonathan Hale had spent 2 nights chained to the damp wall, counting every creak of the pavilion above, every slow drip of water from the ceiling. The thick chains that held him were anchored to a section of old masonry, crumbling from years of moisture. He had tested the bolts in the brief, quiet moments when no one was watching, feeling the faintest, almost imperceptible give under his sustained pressure. Now, with the sound of footsteps fading down the corridor, he braced his bare feet against the wall and pulled. The metal groaned, a low, guttural sound that might have carried if not for the muffled, drug-induced cries from deeper in the basement. Again, he heaved, his shoulders straining, the rusted iron biting deep into the raw flesh of his wrists. The bolt shifted, just a whisper of movement, but it was enough. He pushed harder. The stone around the anchor cracked with a sharp sound like breaking ice. Hale stumbled forward, his chains dragging behind him, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm in his ears. He crossed to Eleanor's cell and knelt by her side, whispering her name until her eyes fluttered open. They were hazy from the lingering effects of Drexler's drugs, but they sharpened with a flicker of disbelief when she saw that he was free. "We don't have much time," he said, his fingers fumbling with the lock on her shackle. They moved like ghosts from cell to cell, freeing those who they could. Jonas Breck stared at Hale blankly, his mind lost in a chemical fog, until Eleanor crouched before him, her voice low and urgent. "Jonas, it's me. Eleanor, we're leaving. Now." Something in her tone, a familiar sound from a life he had almost forgotten, cut through the haze. The giant shifted his immense weight forward, the chain rattling as Hale pulled at the lock, far above them, in the laboratory. Peter Lang was earning every precious second of this fragile opportunity, As Drexler prepared the first syringe of morphine, Peter stepped forward, injecting a calculated note of irritation into his voice. Sheriff Cray wants them alert for questioning first. He lied. Says Vennick might want to see them perform one last time. He let the sentence trail off ominously. Drexler paused, the syringe hovering in his hand. His eyes narrowed with suspicion. "That is not in the protocol," he hissed. Peter shrugged, feigning indifference as though the change had come from a higher authority. "Cray says the sheriff's word is final. If you have a problem, you can take it up with him yourself." Drexler's mouth thinned into a hard line, but he set the lethal syringe aside. "Very well," he conceded. "We'll begin later." Back in the basement, Hale and Eleanor faced a hard truth. Not everyone could move. Celeste Morrow could barely sit upright without collapsing into a fit of coughing. Another man's legs were swollen and useless from years of being chained. Those who could walk supported those who could not, forming a desperate, limping line toward the narrow stairs. But every freed prisoner was another chain clanking in the dark, another chance for a sound to carry upward. Hale could already hear faint thuds from above the shuffle of boots. A door slamming shut. The window of their escape was shrinking. It was the sharp sound of a lock clicking shut upstairs that made Hale's skin prickle. A moment later, a voice echoed down the stairwell, sharp, angry, and unmistakable. "Where is Lang?" Drexler's words bounced off the cold stone walls. Peter's voice followed. "Too quick, too nervous. He's just checking supplies." There was the sound of a chair scraping back hard across a wooden floor, then heavy boots crossing the room above. The door to the basement stairs banged open, and Drexler appeared in the lantern's glow, his eyes narrowing as they swept over the sight of empty chains dangling from the walls, for a single, frozen heartbeat. He stood there, the perfect picture of a meticulous man watching his master plan unravel into chaos. Then he turned and shouted back toward the main floor. "They're loose." The words were a gunshot in the dark. Within seconds, the thud of boots on wood was everywhere. Vennick's polished, hurried tread, Cray's heavier, more deliberate stride, and at least two other pairs, quicker and more chaotic. Hale pushed the ragged line of freed captives forward. "Go!" he barked. Jonas Breck lumbered ahead, his great shoulders nearly filling the narrow corridor. They had just reached the first corner when the light from the stairwell fled, throwing the long, menacing shadow of a man with a revolver onto the wall. Vennick stepped into view, his immaculate waistcoat a jarring, obscene contrast to the filth around him. Behind him, Sheriff Cray raised a shotgun, the wide muzzle swinging slowly toward the captives. The footsteps on the stairs behind them grew louder, steadier, until a new voice, calm and authoritative, cut through the tension. "Sheriff Cray, step away from those people." Vennick's head snapped toward the sound, raw disbelief flickering across his face. Cray hesitated, then turned to see Reverend Elias Monroe standing halfway down the stairs, flanked by three uniformed officers in the dark blue of the New Hampshire State Police. The lead officer leveled his rifle. "Lower the weapons. Now!" For a moment, no one moved. Then Vennick's mask of composure finally cracked. "You've made a serious mistake coming here," he snarled. What followed was chaos. Cray took a step back to block the narrow stairwell. Vennick pivoted, barking orders to the two hired men at his back. The officers advanced, but in the crush of bodies, guards, lawmen, and stumbling prisoners, the scene dissolved into a storm of shouting and shoving. In the confusion, Peter Lang slipped down a side passage, the one he had tried to signal to Hale earlier, and dragged a heavy crate aside. "This way," he hissed. Hale pushed Eleanor forward, but behind them, Jonas Breck had lingered. His eyes were fixed on the office door at the far end of the basement. Wennick had retreated there with Drexler, slamming it shut and bolting it from the inside. The barricaded office door shuddered under the first blow. Inside, Alistair Wennick stood over a small fire blazing in a metal wastebasket, frantically feeding it pages torn from his ledger. Dr. Drexler crouched beside a cabinet, stuffing glass vials into a leather satchel. From the hallway came another blow, louder this time, followed by a deep, guttural roar that made the hair on Wennick's neck stand on end. Jonas Breck's massive frame filled the doorway, his hands gripping the edge of the heavy desk they had used as a barricade. With the surge of strength that years of abuse and drugs had not destroyed, he heaved the heavy furniture aside as if it were kindling. The wood splintered, the door frame cracked, and the lock tore free. The state police officers were right behind him. Drexler froze, his face drained of all color, and slowly lifted his hands. Wennick, however, did not surrender so easily. "Gentlemen," he said, tossing another sheaf of paper into the fire, a mocking smile playing on his lips. "I'm afraid you're too late. Whatever crimes you imagine have gone up in smoke." He didn't notice Hale slip in behind the officers, his eyes darting to the remnants of the ledger on the desk. Combined with the photographs he'd taken, it would be enough. Jonas stepped forward, his bulk eclipsing the lantern light, and placed one enormous, trembling hand on Wennick's shoulder. The message was clear. Whatever power the showman had held in this town, in this basement, was over. The trials that followed were unlike anything Barford Hollow, or indeed New Hampshire, had ever seen before. The courtrooms in Concord overflowed with reporters, sketch artists, and curious onlookers. Testimony from the 17 survivors was harrowing, chilling accounts of kidnappings, of false death certificates, of years of confinement, and of the slow, methodical erasure of identity under the guise of performance. The surviving pages of the ledger, matched with Jonathan Hale's photographs and Peter Lang's detailed account of the basement's routines, created an airtight case. Official records state that Alistair Wennick was convicted on 43 counts of kidnapping, 17 counts of unlawful imprisonment, and 26 counts of murder for those marked discontinued. His execution was carried out on March 14th, 1893. Dr. Wilhelm Drexler avoided the gallows by cooperating with prosecutors, his testimony leading to arrests in 5 other states where similar carnival acquisitions had taken place. He'd received life imprisonment. Sheriff Roland Cray, stripped of his badge in the basement that night, was sentenced to 20 years for corruption and accessory to murder. He served only 7 before dying of a heart attack in his cell. For the 17 who survived, the paths forward were uneven and fraught with pain. Eleanor Price, finding a new purpose in her trauma, became a fierce public advocate for the victims of trafficking. Her testimony before state legislators leading to landmark reforms. Jonas Breck, though permanently scarred in mind and body, lived quietly in a Philadelphia church community, finding solace in tending gardens until his death in 1923. Celeste Morrow never regained her full, beautiful voice, but she returned to her hometown in Maine, where she taught music to children, her spirit unbroken. Jonathan Hale's coverage of the case earned him national recognition, and he moved to Boston, working alongside Margaret Lell on a series of exposés that dismantled other trafficking networks across the country. Barford Hollow itself bore a strange and heavy legacy. The Opera Pavilion was demolished within a year of the raid, its lot left vacant and overgrown until a small memorial garden was built there in 1935. A simple bronze plaque bears the names of the 17 who were returned from the dead, alongside the 26 who never would be, legislatively. The case spurred real change, tighter oversight of traveling shows, mandatory performer identification, and improved cooperation between state and local law enforcement. Yet, even as the legal victories stacked up, the unanswered questions lingered. Drexler's testimony revealed that some of the discontinued had not been killed, but had been sold, vanishing into other, deeper shadows across the eastern states. No record ever surfaced of their final fate. In the end, the Burford Hollow case became more than a story about one man's spectacular cruelty. It became a chilling reminder of how greed and indifference could hollow out a community from within, and how those left in the dark could be made complicit without ever lifting a hand. The 17 survivors were officially restored to the living in the state records, their false death certificates declared null and void, but somewhere in the unmarked pages of history. One has to wonder how many others were still out there, misnamed, unseen, and unheard. And in towns much like Burford Hollow, how many other doors were still locked from the inside,